Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, what will the Timberwolves do when Karl-Anthony Towns returns? How will Chris Finch, how will he stagger his rotation? How often will Kat and Rudy play together? Who might lose out on minutes? And how easy will it be, or difficult, I guess, to reintegrate Karl-Anthony Towns? We're starting to get close to needing to consider that possibility. And in light of the Wolves' big win over the Mavs, I want to talk about it today. Let's get into it. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code Locked On. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day. And weirdly, not a Timberwolves game day. The Wolves don't play again until Thursday night at home against Washington. We'll talk more about that on tomorrow's show. Today, plenty to get to. I want to talk a lot about the reintegration of Karl-Anthony Towns, which I'm excited that it really feels like, we don't know anything officially, but we're getting closer to needing to consider that possibility. And in light of some of the adjustments the Wolves had to make against Dallas on Monday, I think it's a really topical conversation. So I want to do that here for the majority of the show here today. First of all, though, off the top, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, from Apple to Google to Spotify and Odyssey and beyond. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app. That's on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All of the Minnesota podcasts can be found there. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow this show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves. Don't forget the T, and also my account, which is at Beecken, with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, so big Wolves win over the Mavs on Monday, and if you missed Tuesday's show, that was the post-game podcast, went into pretty great detail on that win. One of the big things to come out of that was the Timberwolves building what was a 26-point lead at one point with Rudy Gobert on the floor. Rudy was a huge part of it and was a plus 17 for the game, by far a Timberwolves high for the game. Nobody else was greater than a plus 9 in terms of individual plus minus. Rudy had 21 and 14. He shot a perfect 9 of 9 from the field, but he only played 30 minutes. And that's because down the stretch, Dallas did what so many teams did, including actually famously Dallas in the playoffs last season against the Utah Jazz. They played him off the floor, and they basically did. And there's a couple things to take away from this. But I'm going to take the angle, and I talked about this on Tuesday's show pretty extensively, but I want to take the angle of, like, what does this look like when Karl-Anthony Towns is back? So first, specific to the situation, I think Chris Finch did the right thing. Clearly, the Wolves won the game, and I realize that they gave up a bunch more points also once Gobert was off the floor. But it's all about being a head coach is so much about pushing the right buttons, pulling the right levers at the right time. And as much as analytics tells us, and as important as it is, and also X's and O's, right? There is a level of human element of feel to a game. As difficult as that might be to measure, again, analytically, like really tangibly. And I'll be the first to call out whatever pundit analyst on TV that wants to talk about, there's certain things that don't exist, right? The overall, a lot of momentum isn't real, right? Like statistically, it doesn't exist. However, there is a level of that. And I don't know what percentage it is that matters, whatever, but the timing of when you make these moves matters. And I think Chris Finch did the right thing in this game by pulling Rudy when he did, and then by not putting him back in the game. And it ended up working. Kyle Anderson made a big defensive play on Luka Doncic. And then, of course, down the stretch with Dallas spreading the Wolves out, Minnesota was happy to counter with Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards at the point of attack and shut Dallas down on that final possession, not even allowing Kyrie and Luka to get a shot off. But I think the right buttons were pushed, the right levers were pulled by Chris Finch. And Rudy Gobert was such a big part of building that lead, right? And the Wolves, obviously, they have to play big because they're signed up for this with a couple of max players, max 7-footers in Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. So what does this look like moving forward? Well, let's start here. I think the most exciting thing is that Chris Finch has myriad options available to him, right? The Timberwolves can play ultra big like they started the year wanting to do with Rudy at the 5 and Karl-Anthony Towns at the 4, Jaden McDaniels at the 3, Ant at the 2, and now you've got a little smaller at the 1 with Conley instead of D'Angelo Russell, but it's still a massive lineup. You've also got Kyle Anderson to mix in there. You could play Kyle Anderson at the 3 if you really wanted to, if McDaniels is in foul trouble or whatever. Taurean Prince at the 3. All those guys are big threes that in a lot of cases are best cast as 4s in today's NBA. But for the Wolves, when they're going to play big, all those guys could play the 3. And that's one option. I think that's option 1A, right? That's what the Wolves want to do. There's, of course, the choice of staggering Towns and Rudy Gobert. Now they're both going to start together. I don't think there's any question about that. But I think this is important to note. When Towns comes back, I'm sure the Wolves are going to try and get him to a point where he's not really on a minutes limit, but you can also bet that he will be on a minutes limit for a little bit of time, right? I mean, Jordan McLaughlin, I don't know if he still is, but a lot of times those last for 2-3 games, whatever. Perhaps there will be something of a limit, or even if it's not officially imposed by the medical team, I could see Finch using this as a way to stagger Gobert and Towns even more. So what I mean by that is they'll start, maybe they play 5 minutes together to the 7-minute mark in the first quarter, and then Cat gets his rest. Rudy plays another 5 minutes. Cat comes in with 2 minutes left in the quarter, or maybe it's the other way around. I mean, who knows? Again, it depends on the minutes limit. Usually Rudy gets the first rest. But maybe that stint is shorter where they're on the floor together, and the stints where they're not on the floor, where they're on the floor separately, are elongated a little bit. Who loses minutes? Like Naz reads the obvious answer. We'll get, and I want to answer that. Next segment, I want to dig in on that a bit more beyond Naz. But maybe with how well Naz has played, they give him a bit, 8-10 minute role where he is both Cat and Rudy are resting, Cat perhaps on a minutes limit, Rudy because you just can't play him 40 minutes a game. Maybe that's part of the solution, right? But I really don't think that they'll play as many minutes together, even if they start together and they start the third quarter together, and ideally they're on the floor together in crunch time. I think that Chris Finch is going to be willing to be more creative with that pairing and with staggering them. The other thing I think that's really important to point out is that many of the issues early on in the season when the Wolves were under 500 were not specific to Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert, right? What I mean by that is Cat and Rudy together, it felt like their chemistry was actually not too bad. Remember all those Towns entry passes to Gobert? I would posit that Towns was actually the best entry passer, the best player on the Wolves at getting the ball to Gobert in the paint or in the dunker spot throughout the first 2 months of the season. I mean, who is better than Karl-Anthony Towns? D'Angelo Russell struggled with it. Anderson and McDaniels have both gotten better. Anthony Edwards has gotten a little better, but he's still struggling with that chemistry with Gobert, pick and roll game, just high-low passing. Towns was I think he was the best passer over those opening really 6-7 weeks of the season before he got injured at getting the ball to Gobert in the post. And in hindsight, I should have looked up how many of Gobert's baskets in October, November were assisted by Karl-Anthony Towns. I think it's probably a higher number than a fan not following the Wolves would assume, right? The chemistry between Towns and Gobert was actually pretty strong in October and November. The problem was the guards were unable to figure out how to get Rudy the ball, and Towns was the one that was initiating. So much offense was still running through Cat, as it should, that when Ant and D'Lo got the ball, it became that take-turn offense that we've talked about so often on this show, where it was like, okay, I got the ball. I better shoot now because I don't know when it's going to come back to me. Well, now you remove D'Lo from that equation. You give Ant, this whole season so far of chemistry working with Rudy Gobert. They've played a ton of games together now. And hopefully Towns and Rudy still have something of that chemistry. So if it's Ant and Towns initiating and you add in Mike Conley, and through 2 games, we've already seen incredible chemistry between Conley and Gobert. Clearly that hasn't left since their time together in Utah. Now you've got 2 players in Cat and Conley that are comfortable working with Gobert, and you add an Ant who's getting more comfortable. And frankly, like we saw against Dallas, like who cares? When Ant decides he wants to take over, he can take over. Gobert still got his in that game, shot 9 of 9 from the field. I feel really optimistic about adding Towns back into this offense. I mean, think about it this way. The Wolves are playing essentially 4 out now with Gobert. I mean, they're not really playing like a 4-out offense, but basically that's what their sets are, right? Like Gobert is the only guy kind of roaming the back line down on the baseline, right? They're running horn sets. They're running stuff where everybody's on the perimeter besides Gobert. They can still do that, just subbing Karl-Anthony Towns for Kyle Anderson. Sub in a better career 3-point shooter and a more dynamic offensive player. It's the same thing. It's just more dynamic with Towns. Why would they have to both be down low, clogging the paint, etc.? Gobert and Ant are starting to figure out that chemistry too, in terms of, remember early in the season when Ant even said publicly after a game that the paint is more crowded and he's got to figure it out. That hasn't been as much of an issue lately because Rudy's understanding, hey, I got to hold in the dunker spot. I got to space a little bit more. I can't crowd Ant. Playing with Anthony Edwards is different than playing with Mike Conley. And so Rudy Gobert is a smart basketball player. He can figure out who's got the ball in their hands, what's the set, like what's happening here, where do I need to be on the floor, and have that feel for spacing. And we haven't seen that all season. I think Gobert is starting to click with him and Ant. And imagine Towns in the Kyle Anderson role or Towns in the Jaden McDaniels role if McDaniels is in foul trouble. The offense becomes that much more dynamic. You can still spread the floor. Rudy's the only one down low. You're not posting up Karl-Anthony Towns on the block, more than once or twice a game. And he's only doing that most likely if Rudy's not in the game at all. So I think also a huge part of this is going to be the Karl-Anthony Towns, Mike Conley chemistry. And I mean, there's not much to say about that because we have no idea what that'll look like, but that's going to be something to keep an eye on. One more thought related to that, and then I want to get into who loses minutes from the Wolves rotation now, besides the obvious, which would be Naz Reid. So I want to get to that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at PrizePicks. On Thursday against the Washington Wizards, I'll probably take Rudy Gobert over on rebounds. I feel like he's in a bit of a groove, and two more days off. I think we're seeing the rest really help Rudy. You could take Anthony Edwards points over too. I don't know what it's going to be, but Ant is also in a bit of a groove. We'll talk more about that later in the show. But if you're not familiar with PrizePicks, it's a ton of fun. You just pick 2 to 6 players, and whether or not they'll score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. You're not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you watch. That includes the NBA, of course, as well as really every other sport. NHL currently, college sports, college basketball, MLB starts soon. All those sports are available on PrizePicks. You can make your entries in less than 60 seconds. It really is that easy. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, they'll give you $50. Don't forget to enter the promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match of up to $100. All right, last point on Towns rejoining the lineup. Again, like I think it's not going to be maybe as difficult as on its face, right? You would assume adding a high usage guy like Towns, it's going to be, but I think Towns has seen the offense have more success here of late and is watching Conley interact with Rudy and with Anthony Edwards. Everybody's still getting theirs that needs it, right? Jaden McDaniels had a big game. I mean, Jaden McDaniels scored what, 19? Yeah, he had 19 on 8 shots. That's an efficient 19 points. Karl-Anthony Towns can be even more efficient. He's a superior offensive player, and obviously he's going to want more than 8 shots a game. But it just adds another element to your offense. And if Conley's not on the floor, like say it's, Jordan McLaughlin initiating, you're going to see a steady diet of McLaughlin and Towns, pick and roll and pick or really pick and pop. There's so many more things you can do with Cat than you can do with Anderson, McDaniels, Prince. Yes, those guys are all good players in their own right and add something to the team. Obviously, they're role players, right? But think about the additional element to the game that Karl-Anthony Towns will add. And again, spacing, I don't think is an issue. You're playing 4 out with Rudy in the dunker spot now. Just keep doing that with Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor, and it's going to go really, really well, most likely. The last thing I want to say, mentioning or related to that, is Towns and Gobert, their 2-man numbers so far this season are not great, but they're not maybe as bad as we might remember. So, like, for instance, Towns and Edwards' 2-man numbers on the floor together in 591 minutes over just 21 games early this season was a -2 net rating. Towns and D'Lo were a -4.8 net rating. Towns did have a positive 2-man with Jaden McDaniels. It's a +1.7. But Towns and Gobert together was a very slight negative, a -0.7 in 401 minutes. So they played 401 minutes together earlier this season. Were a slight negative, a -0.7. The Wolves defense obviously was much better with Rudy on the floor, Cat off. The offense was much better with Cat on the floor, Rudy off. And now the Wolves have gotten used to playing with just Rudy on the floor. Because Towns is such a good offensive player in his own right, I don't worry about the Wolves offense with Rudy off the floor and Towns on the floor. And with Conley and Gobert together, I don't think we worry too much about the Towns off numbers offensively, right? And more likely than not, Anthony Edwards is on the floor while Towns is resting often. I think Finch will stagger it that way. So another kind of question for Chris Finch is how he's going to try and match up those, say, Conley coming back in the game while Gobert comes back in the game, and maybe the Towns minutes line up a little, the Towns only minutes line up a bit more with Jordan McLaughlin, who has more familiarity with, whereas the Conley lines up with the Rudy only minutes. And then obviously Conley's playing the Rudy plus Cat minutes. I think it'll be something like that to maintain some of that pick and roll, the dynamic possibilities of the pick and roll with Conley and Gobert, and the ability that they already clearly have to work together. But the Towns Gobert numbers aren't as atrocious as we remember. I think it's because at the time everyone was just wanting this to click much faster, and it was a little head scratching as to why it wasn't. And you had Ant making his comments about not enough space, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. D'Lo wanting his shots, the take turn offense, all that. And now, looking back on it, a minus 0.7 is not great when you're talking about two all-stars who you're paying max money to start together and get you to the playoffs and beyond. But grand scheme of things, minus 0.7 is fixable. It wasn't a disaster. And again, I posit to you that it was not the Towns-Gobert chemistry as much as it was the lack of ability to get Gobert the ball from primarily D'Angelo Russell, but also the Wolves perimeter players in general. And I think that level of skill has gone up exponentially with Mike Conley, and then also playing a little bit more, Taurean Prince, Kyle Anderson, both initiating a little more offense and being more involved in the rotation. I think also it has a big hand to play in that. Which brings me to my next topic, which is who loses minutes when Karl-Anthony Towns returns. The obvious answer is Naz Reid. So I don't think we need to dig into that one too much. Like I said earlier, it wouldn't shock me if Chris Finch tries to find a way to find him minutes. But I also worry that Naz is one of those players in short stints that maybe doesn't find a rhythm and tries to do too much in those short minutes. We actually saw a little bit of that on Monday night against Dallas. There were those sloppy, or Tuesday night. I don't know. I'm losing track. Monday night against Dallas. There was some sloppy moments there for Naz, some missed threes, some bad passes, etc. So I don't know that works as well. I don't know that Naz plays as well in short minutes. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. But I think the players who are most in danger of losing minutes are actually some of the players who've been playing the best. We'll start with Kyle Anderson. Before the injury to Karl-Anthony Towns, Kyle Anderson only averaged 20.5 minutes per game, 20 and a half minutes per game. And after the injury, he is averaging 28.8 minutes per game. Now, he's primarily been a starter. There have obviously been the back spasm issues, et cetera, and that's actually messed up. There's been a handful of games he's left early, both sides of the Towns injury. But he's averaging essentially 29 minutes per game, was averaging just under 21 minutes a game before. I think that number probably comes down a little. And I know how important he is to the team. And I think Finch is going to try and find a way to get him closer to 29 minutes than to 21 minutes. But we're going to see a little less Kyle Anderson and perhaps playing him with the second unit. And this is just me speculating. Perhaps Anderson coming off the bench with the second unit on Monday against Dallas was a bit of Chris Finch thinking ahead a few steps and saying, okay, Anderson's going to get back to playing with the bench a little bit more often. It doesn't mean he can't play crunch time, right? Depending on matchups, if Gobert gets played off the floor again and Towns is at the 5, Anderson's probably your 4 down the stretch with McDaniels at the 3. Again, depending on matchups, depending on foul trouble, if McDaniels is hurt or not hurt, well, hopefully not hurt. If he's in foul trouble, perhaps it's Taurean Prince at the 3 and it's Anderson at the 4 and it's Towns at the 5. Or maybe Anderson, again, it's completely dependent on game situation and matchups. And I think that's one of the things Chris Finch has been pretty good at recently, is feeling that out. So Anderson his minutes may not reduce all that much, but that's my theory, is that's in part why Chris Finch had him coming off the bench on Monday against the Mavs, because again, the Wolves have not said when Towns is returning. There's only one more game pre-All-Star break. The Timberwolves' first game post-All-Star break is a week from this Friday. So about 10 days from now, 9-10 days from now. Could Karl-Anthony Towns be back immediately after the break? I mean, he's not wearing a boot on the bench. He's been traveling with the team. We don't have a timeline, but we'll see what happens. This is just me kind of surmising that perhaps this was a test to see how Prince works with the starting lineup, but more so Anderson working with the second unit. Speaking of Taurean Prince, before the Towns injury, he averaged 19 and a half minutes per game. Post-Towns injury, of course, he was hurt himself, so this is a relatively limited sample, but 23 minutes per game post-Towns injury. So, Anderson is playing about almost 8.5 minutes more per game after the Towns injury. Prince is playing 3.5 minutes per game or more per game since the Towns injury. I think Prince probably loses more minutes than Anderson. Prince has a little bit more positional flexibility, just because he can guard. I think he's more effective guarding. Anderson can still guard really at times 1 through 5. I mean, he played the 5 down the stretch against Dallas on Monday, but Dallas also didn't really have a true big man in there. Prince is a little bit more flexible and a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more of a consistent 3-point shooter. But Anderson kind of does everything else better. And so it'll be interesting to see. This could be completely matchup dependent. Like maybe some nights Anderson's getting 25 minutes and Prince is getting 12. And other nights it could almost flip. I don't know that Anderson ever gets less than 15 a game or 18 a game. But I think there could be games that are more Prince games versus more Kyle Anderson games. All right, a couple more players to talk about. And then I want to talk very quickly about Anthony Edwards' play of late, kind of revisiting just how good he's been here recently. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious treat but don't want all the fat and calories, then you have to try a Built Bar. We just got through the holidays and also Valentine's Day. I mean, there's candy everywhere still. Basically, since Halloween through Valentine's Day, it's candy city. I know my goal is to eat a little healthier this year. If you're like me, where you want to eat healthier, but you don't want to compromise taste, then I've got just the thing for you. You have to try Built. With Built Bars, healthy is actually tasty. Seriously, they're so delicious, you won't even think that they're good for you. It's perfect for your New Year's resolution, which hopefully you're still on top of 6 weeks into the new year. What makes Built Bars so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. They come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. I don't know how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. And what's even better is that they're healthy. Only 130 calories and 4 grams of sugar with a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering your Built Bars at Built.com, which you can still do, but now you can also get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. That's right. Head to your nearest Walmart today. Walk to the pharmacy section and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate or coconut puffs, all delicious flavors. If you're close to Sam's Club, you can just run in and grab a 13-bar box with the hit flavors brownie batter and churro. Just make sure that you thank me later. All right, last thing in terms of rotation and players that were out of the rotation pre-Towns injury that are in the rotation now. Talked about Anderson, talked about Prince. Those guys are going to be in the rotation regardless. Austin Rivers was not in the rotation at all regularly before the Karl-Anthony Towns injury. He's averaged, when he was in the rotation, I should say, there were a couple of games where he filled in injuries, et cetera. D'Lo missed a game or two. There were some reasons why he played. And then, of course, Jordan McLaughlin, the first time he hurt his calf. Rivers averaged about 12 minutes a game, though, before the Towns injury when he played. Post-Towns injury, 23.9 minutes per game. So 24 minutes a game. So basically doubling his minutes per game. Now, we've seen lately the value that he can bring. He had a couple of really nice ISO possessions. He kind of has the ability to straight line drive at any point in time. He's kind of plays with energy and is also a solid defender. I think I've said this before, I think he's a little overrated defensively, but can hold his own against like when he was stuck on Luka Doncic for stretches on Monday, that wasn't ideal. He's kind of like, if McDaniels is in foul trouble, if Edwards gets switched off of, if Prince is not available, like Rivers is kind of the next guy point of attack defender wise. I think he probably ranks slightly ahead of Mike Conley right now in terms of guys who Finch wants to guard the ball handler of the opposing team, but kind of in that same neighborhood as Mike Conley, where, hey, this guy, was a really good defender. He may be a little bit slower now. And in Rivers' case, always maybe a little bit overrated, but still an intelligent defender, an intelligent player at both ends of the floor. And like, I get that Towns is a big and Rivers is a guard, but there's that trickle down, right? Since the Towns injury, we've seen a little more Ant at the 3. We've seen a little more small lineups with Jalen Noel in the game, along with a point guard. And now that McLaughlin's back too, the combination, and I understand that the Rivers minutes also had to do with the McLaughlin injury, but I think it'll be fascinating to see if, similar to Naz Reid, if Chris Finch says, hey, we got to carve out a few minutes for Austin. We got to carve out a few minutes for Naz. Or if Rivers just becomes, hey, McLaughlin's back, Noel's still in the rotation, or is there a chance he takes Noel's rotation minutes? This could be another one where it's pushing the right button, pulling the right lever, depending on matchup. Maybe the Wolves don't need Noel's instant scoring, and they could use somebody who's going to be a little more solid, a little more consistent in terms of spot up 3-point shooting as well. Certainly better defensively. Rivers is a better defender than Noel, no question. Perhaps he eats into some of the Noel minutes. I mean, we could see that depending on the matchup and depending on how any individual game is going within that game. So that'll be something to watch too. So I think Anderson, Prince, and Rivers, the 3 kind of old head veterans, I guess, outside of Mike Conley, those are the guys who stand to lose the most playing time with Karl-Anthony Towns returning. And he's, now that McLaughlin's back and that he's kind of what everybody's waiting on now. When Towns gets back, what does this thing look like? I think it's going to be so fascinating. And the acclimation period, again, like I, talked about the first part of the show, I'm hopeful that it's maybe not as rocky as it was early this season. I think Mike Conley can smooth a lot of things over. And I think that Rudy being comfortable with the team and also with Conley is going to help. And you better believe that Tim Connolly and the front office and Chris Finch and staff have been thinking ahead on this as well. All right. Last thing I want to talk about real quickly, Anthony Edwards. JJ Redick had a tweet early on Tuesday about how we have to have a long conversation. I'm paraphrasing this, but Redick said we have to have a long conversation about how good Edwards has been the last couple of weeks. And I would raise JJ Redick that, and I would say going all the way back to mid-December, right? We did this a couple of weeks ago, and it just keeps getting crazier. But going back to that Bulls game when the Wolves set the franchise record for scoring, this was December 18th, which is, I'll admit, a relatively arbitrary start point, but that's because that's when Ant really took off. Since that point, he's been averaging 26.9 points per game. So we'll call it 27 points per game, 6 rebounds, which is huge. I cannot understate how important the increase in rebound production Anthony Edwards has been. That's been completely under talked about, is how bad this team is rebounding the ball and how terrible it was early this season, especially after the Towns injury. It was a real concern and still is, but Edwards ramping up his rebound. And I've been harping for the last 2 years about how a player with his athleticism, skill, size, all those things, there's no excuse for him to be grabbing 2-3 boards a game like he had been early in his career. And frankly, for a lot of late October throughout November, but he's averaging 6 boards a game since December 18th. Also 4.9 assists per game. So we'll call it 5. So 27.6 rebounds, 5 assists per game. His 27 points are coming on 47.4% shooting, just a hair under 37% from 3. So above league average there too. And over 80% from the free throw line on 5.5 free throw attempts per game. The efficiency's been incredible. It's really improved for Ant. I mean, there's only a couple of games. Like you look at his game log. There's only a couple that stand out as poor performances. That bad loss to Orlando, he shot 5 of 15, 1 of 7 from 3. There was the loss to Denver where he shot 7 of 17, missed all of his 3-point attempts, scored only 16 points. And then there was that really bad, I guess they beat the Clippers back early January, but Ant only played 22 minutes, scored 5 points. And, that's how good he's been. Like I just picked out 3 games. He scored 19 or more points in every other game. I just picked 3 that he wasn't good at. That's it. And we're talking, how many games is this? 31 games going back to mid-December. He scored 19 or more points in, I think it's actually 27 of the 31 games. Ant has been incredible. And the defense needs more consistency, but we all saw, the NBA world saw what McDaniels and Ant did to Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving at the end of Wolves-Mavs on Monday. That is the defense that Ant has played on and off the last really 12 months or so, going back to middle of last season. He just needs to do it consistently. Just some level of consistency defensively. And he can be an all-defense player as soon as next season. And that is what, at this point, in my opinion, is keeping him from that next tier of superstar, like to be a true superstar. And I know now he's got all-star next to his name. He's an injury replacement. But to truly take that next step, the defense has to be consistent. And I know some of the other, like there's some offensive efficiency stuff. The turnovers are still high. But remember, he's 21 years old. Like he's barely 21 and a half years old, right? So there's still a lot of growth to be had here. And the fact that he is where he is right now is incredible. And I think the NBA is finally starting to wake up and take notice. We'll see what Ant does in the All-Star game on Sunday. We'll talk more about that later this week, and I'll have some predictions for that as well. All right, that's all we have for today. We'll, of course, have a show as well on Thursday, and then we'll also preview Wolves-Wizards Thursday night. We'll do the post-game pod Friday, and we'll get you ready for All-Star Weekend. That's all coming here the rest of the week. A big thank you to those that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Now you can make your second listen the Game to Game NBA podcast. Every moment, every top performance, and every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.